At 07:45 hours on September 20th, 1944, Major Charles Carpenter climbed into his L-4 Grasshopper at a forward airstrip near Aricourt, France, a high school history teacher from Moline, Illinois, who had spent peacetime teaching teenagers about ancient Rome and coaching high school football. This morning he was preparing to attack German tanks, not with bombs or cannons, with bazookas, 6 of them, mounted 3 to each wing strut of an unarmed fabric-covered observation plane that cost $2,600 and flew at 85 miles per hour. His aircraft was serial number 43-30426. He had nicknamed it Rosie the Rocketer. 262 German armored vehicles were moving toward the 4th Armored Division's positions. 75 Panzer Mark IVs, 107 Panther tanks, 80 self-propelled assault guns, the largest German armored counterattack in France since D-Day. Carpenter's job that morning was supposed to be observation, spotting targets, calling artillery fire missions, adjusting rounds onto German positions from 1,500 feet altitude where he could see for miles in every direction. That was what L-4 pilots did. That was what the aircraft was designed for. But Carpenter had realized weeks earlier that observation alone wasn't enough when you were facing Tiger tanks and Panthers that could kill American Shermans from ranges where the Shermans couldn't fight back. So he had turned his observation plane into a tank destroyer, and this morning at Aricourt, he was going to prove the concept worked. The problem had been obvious for months. American artillery was the finest in the world, could deliver more shells more accurately and faster than any military in history. But artillery couldn't hit what it couldn't see. And the only way artillery could see deep behind enemy lines, could spot targets as they moved, could adjust fire in real time, was from the air. That job belonged to the L-4 Grasshopper and the men who flew them. Artillery officers who had volunteered for pilot training learned to fly the simple Piper Cubs the Army had adopted as observation aircraft, then gone forward with artillery battalions to spot targets and direct fire. The system worked brilliantly when it worked. An L-4 at 1,500 feet could see everything, could watch enemy movement, could identify artillery positions by their muzzle flashes, could call fire missions and adjust the rounds onto target in real time. When American artillery had aerial observation, response time dropped to 3 minutes from enemy movement to shells landing on target. German artillery, relying on ground observers and slower communications, needed 10 to 15 minutes to accomplish the same mission. That 7 to 12-minute difference was decisive in combat. American infantry and armor learned quickly that if they had L-4 support, enemy artillery and mortar positions would be destroyed within minutes of opening fire. German units learned just as quickly that if American L-4s were overhead, movement meant death. But the L-4 pilots paid a terrible price for that effectiveness. The aircraft was slow, maybe 85 miles per hour at top speed, cruised at 75, had a service ceiling between 9,000 and 12,000 feet depending on the variant, was constructed of fabric stretched over a welded steel tube frame, carried no armor, no weapons, just a pilot and sometimes an observer crammed into a tiny cockpit designed for civilian flight instruction. When German troops saw an L-4, every weapon pointed upward: rifles, machine guns, anti-aircraft guns, artillery pieces with reduced elevation. Everything that could shoot shot at the slow fabric-covered Cubs putting around overhead directing American artillery fire. Some L-4 pilots survived dozens of missions without taking serious damage. Others died on their first sortie. The aircraft could absorb surprising punishment. Fabric could be patched. Control cables could be jury-rigged. Pilots brought aircraft home with dozens of bullet holes. But there was no margin for error. One round through the engine, and you were landing in enemy territory. One round that severed the right control cable and the aircraft became uncontrollable. The little Cubs were tough, but they weren't invincible. And in the heavy fighting after D-Day, L-4s were being shot down at an alarming rate. The Normandy breakout in June and July of 1944 had been brutal for L-4 crews. The hedgerow fighting, the close-range engagements, German infantry with machine guns and automatic weapons in every field. L-4 pilots flew low, slow, and conspicuous over some of the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire of the entire war. They kept flying because American artillery depended on them, because infantry advancing through hedgerows needed immediate fire support, because armor pushing through German positions needed someone overhead spotting anti-tank guns and coordinating artillery. The L-4 pilots flew and died and kept flying. By late summer of 1944, the survivors had developed tactics: fly at varying altitudes, change course unpredictably, use clouds for concealment when available, coordinate with friendly fighters who would strafe German positions before the L-4 came overhead, work in teams so one aircraft could spot while another called fire missions, learn the sound of different weapons so you knew when 88mm flak was coming up versus rifle fire. All of it helped. None of it solved the fundamental problem. The L-4 was an unarmed observation aircraft, flying slow over enemy positions full of people trying to kill the pilot. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Stay overhead long enough to do your job, and eventually someone would hit you. But what really frustrated pilots like Carpenter was watching German armor operate beyond effective American response. The Tiger tanks, the Panthers, German heavy armor that outranged American Shermans, could sit at 2,000 yards and destroy American tanks that couldn't penetrate the German armor at that distance. American artillery could kill Tigers and Panthers if they could get coordinates. But by the time the L-4 spotted the tank, called the fire mission, adjusted the rounds, the German armor had often displaced, moved to new positions. The really good German tank commanders never stayed static when American L-4s were overhead. They knew the L-4 meant American artillery was coming, so they fired and moved, making themselves difficult targets while continuing to destroy American armor. Charles Carpenter had been thinking about this problem since Normandy. He was 31 years old in the summer of 1944. Before the war, he had spent his days teaching high school history and coaching football players on strategy and discipline, led a comfortable civilian life in Moline, Illinois. Then came Pearl Harbor. Carpenter enlisted, left his classroom and football field behind, volunteered for artillery, qualified for the organic aviation program that trained artillery officers to fly L-4 aircraft, went through pilot training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, learned to fly the Piper J-3 Cub and its military variant, the L-4 Grasshopper, shipped to England, joined the 4th Armored Division as an artillery observation pilot, flew his first combat missions during the Normandy breakout. Carpenter brought a teacher's analytical mind to combat flying. He studied problems, looked for solutions, adapted when situations changed. And by August of 1944 he had identified what he considered the core tactical problem facing L-4 pilots supporting armored operations. The aircraft could see German tanks, could call artillery fire on them, but artillery took time to respond, and German armor could displace between the time the L-4 called the mission and the time shells landed. What the L-4 needed was its own direct fire capability, something the pilot could employ immediately upon spotting a target, something that could kill a tank. Carpenter knew other pilots had experimented with arming L-4 aircraft. 2 lieutenants named Harley Merrick and Roy Carson had mounted bazookas on their L-4s earlier in the European campaign, had used them successfully to destroy German trucks and light vehicles. Carpenter had heard the stories, knew it could be done. So, in late August or early September of 1944, exact date lost to history, Carpenter obtained 6 M1A1 bazooka launchers and started mounting them on his L-4H aircraft. The M1A1 bazooka was a simple weapon, smoothbore tube, 60mm diameter, 54 inches long, weighed approximately 13 pounds, fired a 3.5-pound rocket with a shaped charge warhead designed to penetrate armor. Effective range against tanks may be 100 to 150 yards, maximum range 300 yards. Simple iron sights, basic firing mechanism, cheap to manufacture. Issued to infantry for close-range anti-tank defense. Not designed to be mounted on aircraft, certainly not on L-4 Grasshoppers. But Carpenter wasn't concerned with official design parameters. He was concerned with killing German tanks. He mounted 3 bazookas on each wing strut, simple metal brackets fabricated by unit mechanics, tubes positioned parallel to the wing structure. The mounting had to be secure enough to withstand flight loads and vibration, but simple enough to be installed and removed in the field. Carpenter wired the firing mechanisms together so all 6 could fire simultaneously from a single electrical switch mounted in the cockpit within easy reach. Each bazooka held 1 rocket, 6 total ready to fire. After firing all 6 tubes, the bazookas were empty and useless. Carpenter would have to land, have his ground crew reload all 6 tubes with fresh rockets, then take off again to continue attacking. It was inefficient by conventional weapons standards, but it worked with the resources available. The entire installation weighed maybe 106 pounds, 6 bazooka tubes at 13 pounds each, plus rockets at 3.5 pounds each, plus mounting brackets and electrical wiring. The L4 could handle the weight. The aircraft had a gross weight capacity of 1,220 pounds. Empty weight around 740 pounds. That left 480 pounds for pilot, fuel, observer if carried, and any additional equipment. Carpenter weighed approximately 150 pounds. Fuel maybe 60 pounds for a standard load. Radio equipment, another 30 pounds. That left about 240 pounds of margin. The bazooka installation used less than half that margin. The aircraft would fly, slower than normal, less maneuverable than normal, but it would fly, and with 6 bazooka rockets, it could kill tanks. Carpenter Test flew the armed L4 in early September. The aircraft handled acceptably, slower, heavier, but controllable. He practiced attack runs, diving approaches, shallow glide angles, trying to determine the best attack profile. The bazookas had simple iron sights aligned parallel to the aircraft's flight path. To aim, Carpenter had to point the aircraft at the target. Get within effective range, fire all 6 rockets simultaneously. Hope that at least some of them hit. The accuracy was going to be terrible by conventional standards. Bazookas were not precision weapons. Fired from a moving aircraft at moving targets, the hit probability for any single rocket was low. But Carpenter was firing 6 at once, and he only needed 1 hit to disable or destroy a German tank. He nicknamed the aircraft Rosie the Rocketer, painted the name on the fuselage, started looking for opportunities to test the system in combat. The opportunity came at Aracourt. The Battle of Aracourt began September 18, 1944. The 4th Armoured Division under Major General John S. Tiger Jack Wood had advanced rapidly through France after the Normandy breakout. By mid-September they were approaching the Moselle River in Lorraine. The German 5th Panzer Army was concentrating for a major counterattack. The Germans had assembled 262 armoured vehicles, a massive force by September 1944 standards. The plan was to smash the 4th Armoured Division, recapture lost territory, stabilize the German front before American forces could reach the Rhine. The fighting began September 18th, intensified on the 19th. By September 20th, the battle was fully engaged. German armor pushing hard against American positions. American Shermans fighting defensive battles against superior German tanks. Carpenter climbed into Rosie the Rocketer that morning knowing the German armor was coming, knowing American forces needed every advantage, knowing that 6 bazooka rockets might make a difference. He took off just before 0800 hours, climbed to operational altitude, maybe 1,500 feet, began searching for German armor. The visibility was excellent. Clear morning, good light. Carpenter could see for miles. He spotted German tanks moving in column. Panthers, moving toward American positions. Carpenter circled, studied the formation, picked his target, then he rolled into his attack run. The L4 Dove, shallow angle, maybe 20 to 30 degrees, speed building, wind noise increasing. Carpenter was pointing the aircraft at a Panther tank, getting closer. The range was dropping, 300 yards, 200, 150. The effective range for bazookas. Carpenter pressed the firing button. All 6 rockets fired simultaneously. Smoke trails. The L4 jolted from the sudden weight loss and recoil. Carpenter pulled up, climbing away from the target area. Looked back. 1 rocket had hit. The Panther was burning. First kill. The bazooka system worked. Carpenter returned to base, landed. His ground crew swarmed the aircraft, reloaded all 6 bazooka tubes, new rockets, cleared the launchers, checked the firing mechanism. Carpenter was back in the air within 30 minutes. He flew multiple sorties that day, September 20th, each time taking off with 6 fresh rockets, finding German armor, attacking, landing, reloading, attacking again. He fired at least 16 rockets over the course of the day, hit multiple targets, destroyed multiple German tanks. The exact number of kills that first day is uncertain. Records from the battle are incomplete. But by the end of September 20th, Carpenter had proven the concept. An L-4 Grasshopper with bazooka rockets could kill German heavy armor. Carpenter continued flying armed missions throughout the Battle of Aracourt. The battle lasted until September 29th, 11 days of intense armored combat. By the end, the German counterattack had failed completely. The 4th Armored Division held its positions. The Germans lost 86 tanks destroyed outright. 114 more were damaged or broke down. Total German armored losses 200 vehicles. Only 62 remained operational. The 4th Armored Division losses were comparatively light. American air superiority had been decisive. American artillery, directed by L-4 observation, had been devastating. And for the first time, L-4 aircraft themselves had directly engaged and destroyed enemy armor. Carpenter's final tally from his combat missions over France is unclear. Official records credit him with 6 confirmed tank kills. That included 2 Tiger tanks. The German heavy tanks that American tankers feared most. Tigers that no American tank could reliably penetrate from the front at combat ranges. Carpenter had killed 2 of them with bazooka rockets fired from a fabric-covered observation plane. The 6 confirmed kills made Carpenter a tank ace. By the standards applied to tank commanders, any pilot or tank commander with 5 kills qualified as an ace. Carpenter exceeded that threshold. Unofficial accounts suggest Carpenter destroyed approximately 14 German armored vehicles during his combat tour. The higher number likely includes trucks, half-tracks, and other vehicles that didn't qualify as tanks for official scoring but were still legitimate military targets. The true number will never be known with certainty. But what is certain is that Carpenter proved an L-4 Grasshopper could be an effective tank destroyer. That a pilot with courage and creativity could turn a defensive observation mission into an offensive strike role. That American ingenuity could find solutions to tactical problems using available resources. The Germans noticed. They noticed quickly. German commanders in France during the late summer and early autumn of 1944 faced a fundamental problem. The American Air Force controlled the skies. German ground movement during daylight hours drew immediate air attack. Fighter bombers, medium bombers, artillery, directed by observation aircraft. The combination was devastating. German units that moved during the day suffered terrible casualties. German commanders began restricting movement to dusk and nighttime hours. Orders went out throughout German units in France. Minimize daytime movement. Displace positions at night. Dig in deep before dawn. The restrictions cost the Germans operational flexibility, but they were necessary for survival. A German unit caught moving in column during daylight faced destruction from American air power within minutes. The L-4 observation aircraft were a particular concern for German commanders. The small fabric-covered cubs seemed harmless, but German troops learned quickly that wherever an L-4 appeared, American artillery followed immediately. The L-4s could see everything, could spot German positions, could direct artillery fire with remarkable accuracy, could call in fighter bombers on lucrative targets. German forces responded by shooting at every L-4 they saw. Orders went out to anti-aircraft units, priority target, destroy the American observation aircraft. Infantry units were instructed to engage L-4s with rifle and machine gun fire whenever possible. Artillery crews were trained to depress their guns to minimum elevation and fire at low-flying observation aircraft. Every German soldier understood that the small yellow cubs overhead meant American artillery was watching and would fire within minutes. The Luftwaffe, by this point largely ineffective in air-to-air combat over France due to fuel shortages and overwhelming Allied fighter superiority, was offered specific incentives to hunt L-4s. The German High Command authorized bounties for destroying American observation aircraft. Luftwaffe pilots who shot down an L-4 would receive air medals and leave points. The fact that the German military was offering rewards for destroying unarmed observation planes demonstrates how seriously they took the L4 threat. Captured German documents from the Normandy campaign reveal the extent of German concern about American aerial observation. One report stated that movements and battles come into the foreground at dusk and during darkness in order to block out effect of enemy air force and direct observation by enemy artillery. Another German after-action report noted that American artillery response times were impossibly fast, that American batteries seemed to know German positions before German forces had even completed displacement, that counter-battery fire arrived within minutes of German artillery opening fire. The German analysis correctly identified the cause: American observation aircraft, the L4s that circled over the battlefield at 1,500 feet, spotting every German position and calling immediate fire missions. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, one of Germany's finest commanders, had experienced American artillery directed by L4 observation during the North Africa campaign. In a letter dated February 18, 1943, Rommel wrote about the American system. An observation plane directed the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets throughout the zone. Rommel understood what the L4 represented. The aircraft itself was insignificant, slow, unarmed, vulnerable. But the system it enabled was devastating. American artillery with aerial observation became the dominant weapon on the battlefield. German forces had no effective counter. They could shoot at the L4s, and occasionally they succeeded in downing one. But there were thousands of L4s, thousands of trained artillery officer pilots. Every artillery battalion had 2 L4 aircraft. The Germans couldn't shoot them all down, and as long as L4s were overhead, American artillery could see everything and shoot with devastating accuracy and speed. When German prisoners of war were interrogated about their combat experiences, many mentioned the American observation aircraft. Though most German accounts focused on fighter bombers and medium bombers, the soldiers who had experienced sustained American artillery fire understood what the L4s meant. One captured German report specifically noted the psychological impact. German troops knew that daytime movement brought immediate artillery fire, that American observers were watching constantly, that there was nowhere to hide when the small yellow cubs were overhead. The restrictions on German operations were severe. Units couldn't maneuver effectively during daylight, couldn't concentrate forces for counterattacks, couldn't displace artillery positions without drawing immediate American fire. The L4 hadn't just improved American artillery effectiveness, it had fundamentally altered German tactical options, forced the Wehrmacht into defensive positions and nighttime operations, created a battlefield environment where American ground forces operated with comprehensive intelligence about German positions, while German forces remained largely blind to American dispositions until contact. The strategic impact was enormous. But for the L4 pilots, combat remained intensely dangerous. The aircraft that gave American artillery such dominance was still a slow fabric-covered target, and every German soldier with a weapon knew to shoot at them. The L4 program that produced pilots like Carpenter had begun years before the first combat mission. The story started with the 1941 Louisiana and Texas maneuvers, the largest peacetime military exercises in American history. Hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of vehicles, simulated combat across multiple states. The maneuvers were designed to test Army organization, doctrine, and equipment before America entered what seemed like an inevitable war. During the exercises, the Army experimented with civilian light aircraft for artillery observation. 12 civilian aircraft participated. Piper sent J-3 Cubs. Taylorcraft sent their Model D aircraft. Aeronca sent L-3 Defenders. Civilian pilots flew the aircraft, demonstrated artillery observation capability. The results were immediately impressive. The light aircraft could take off from roads, fields, any reasonably flat surface, could operate close to the front lines, could see targets that ground observers couldn't detect, could communicate directly with artillery batteries and adjust fire in real time. Artillery effectiveness during the exercises increased dramatically when aerial observation was available. Ground force commanders took notice. Lieutenant Colonel Dwight Eisenhower participated in those maneuvers as part of General Walter Kruger's staff. Eisenhower flew in the Piper Cubs, sometimes as observer. Sometimes he piloted the aircraft himself. He saw directly how aerial observation transformed artillery effectiveness. Eisenhower later supported the artillery requests for organic aircraft. His recommendation carried substantial weight. The demonstrations convinced ground commanders that organic aviation was essential, but the Army Air Corps opposed the concept completely. The Air Corps, led by Major General Henry Hap Arnold, believed in centralized control of all aviation assets. Every aircraft should be under Air Corps command. Air Corps doctrine held that ground commanders should request air support through proper channels, that air assets should be allocated by air commanders based on theater priorities. The idea of ground commanders, specifically artillery officers, operating their own aircraft violated fundamental Air Corps principles. Arnold and the Air Corps leadership fought the organic aviation proposal throughout 1941 and into 1942. They argued that it would create a second air force, that it would waste resources, that it would reduce Air Corps control over aviation operations. Arnold formally recommended discontinuing the organic aviation program as late as January 1944. By then, thousands of L-4s were in combat service, and the program had proven itself absolutely essential to American ground operations. But Arnold never stopped opposing it on doctrinal grounds. The bureaucratic battle over organic aviation lasted over a year after the Louisiana and Texas maneuvers. Artillery and ground force advocates pushed for authorization. Air Corps leadership resisted. The debate went to the highest levels of the War Department. Finally, on June 6, 1942, the War Department issued the authorization. Organic aviation for field artillery was official. That date marked the birth of modern Army aviation. The authorization specified that every field artillery battalion would receive 2 L-4 aircraft, 2 pilots who were artillery officers first and aviators second, 1 mechanic per battalion. The pilots would be trained to fly, but they would remain artillery officers, would understand fire direction procedures, would speak the same technical language as the gun crews, would know what information the batteries needed to deliver effective fire. The entire program was remarkably inexpensive. Each L-4 cost approximately $2,600, less than a single artillery piece, less than a quarter of what a Jeep cost. Production contracts were placed immediately. Piper Aircraft Corporation converted their civilian J-3 Cub design into the military L-4 Grasshopper. The changes were minimal. Slightly different paint, military radio equipment, stronger landing gear for rough field operations. Otherwise, the L-4 was mechanically identical to the civilian J-3 Cub that had been flying since the 1930s. Simple aircraft, 65 horsepower Continental engine, fabric covering over a welded steel tube frame, 2 seats in tandem configuration, stick and rudder controls, top speed 85 miles per hour, cruise speed 75. Service ceiling varied by variant from 9,000 to 12,000 feet, depending on engine and equipment load. Stall speed 35 to 38 miles per hour. Gross weight 1,220 pounds. The L-4 could operate from incredibly short runways, could take off in maybe 200 feet with a light load, could land in even less distance. Needed no improved surfaces. Grass fields worked fine. Dirt roads. Anywhere reasonably flat and clear of obstacles. The simplicity was intentional. The L-4 needed to operate close to combat, needed to be maintainable by mechanics with basic training, needed to be flyable by artillery officers who had received abbreviated flight training. Complex aircraft wouldn't have worked. The L-4 succeeded precisely because it was simple and reliable. Production increased rapidly. By February 1942, the Army had 1,600 L-4 aircraft on order. By 1943, over 3,000 were in service. By war's end, total production of L-4 designated aircraft reached 5,413. If you count all military Piper variants, including O-59 designations and other models, the total number of Piper aircraft delivered to the Army exceeded 6,000. The aircraft entered combat on November 9, 1942. Operation Torch. The Allied invasion of North Africa. Captain Ford Ace Alcorn led 3 L-4s that launched from the aircraft carrier USS Ranger, cruising off French Morocco. The little Cubs took off from the carrier deck. An extraordinary feat considering the aircraft had no tailhook, no wing folding mechanism, None of the equipment associated with carrier aviation. They simply took off from the deck like they would from any runway, except the runway was moving and surrounded by ocean. Alcorn navigated the L4s to shore, established forward operating positions near the beaches, immediately started directing naval gunfire against French colonial defensive positions. The system worked exactly as designed. Alcorn and his pilots could see targets from altitude, could identify French artillery positions and defensive works, could communicate with American naval vessels offshore, could adjust naval gunfire in real time. Within hours of landing, the L4s were coordinating effective fire support for troops advancing inland. Response times dropped from hours to minutes. The first combat mission proved what the maneuvers had demonstrated. Organic aviation worked. From North Africa, the L4 program expanded to every theater where American ground forces fought: Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the drive across France, Germany, the Pacific Island campaigns, Burma, China, the Philippines. Everywhere American artillery deployed, L4s provided observation. The aircraft proved remarkably versatile beyond their primary artillery spotting mission. L4 pilots evacuated wounded soldiers, transported urgent supplies to forward units, delivered messages when radio communications failed, flew reconnaissance missions, laid communications wire by flying low with the wire spooling out behind the aircraft. Some creative pilots, like Carpenter, armed their aircraft for ground attack missions. The L4 became indispensable to American ground operations. Infantry commanders learned to request L4 observation before launching attacks. Armor commanders coordinated with L4 pilots to identify enemy positions ahead of tank advances. Artillery battalions relied on their L4s for the majority of targeting information. The fundamental advantage was response time. 3 minutes from enemy movement to American shells on target. That 7 to 12-minute advantage over German artillery response times was decisive in countless engagements. American forces could maneuver, knowing that enemy artillery would be suppressed within minutes. German forces faced the opposite situation. Any movement during daylight hours when L4s were overhead meant immediate American artillery fire. The Pacific Theater saw particularly innovative L4 employment. The U.S. Navy converted LST landing ships into miniature aircraft carriers specifically for L4s. The ships carried 4 grasshoppers each, had short flight decks constructed from timber and pierced steel planking. The L4s could take off in maybe 216 feet from these improvised carriers. Some aircraft used the Brody device for carrier operations, a cable suspended between outriggers with a sliding harness. The L4 would be suspended from the harness by a hook attached to the aircraft. The pilot would climb a rope ladder to the cockpit, apply full power. The aircraft would accelerate down the cable like a zip line and fly off the end when it reached flying speed. Landing involved approaching the cable from behind and snagging it with the hook. Dangerous, but effective. The system allowed L4s to operate from ships offshore during amphibious landings, provided immediate observation capability without waiting for airfields to be captured and prepared. L4 pilots spotted Japanese positions, directed naval gunfire, coordinated with Marine and Army artillery, all from aircraft that launched from ships that had never been designed as carriers. The improvisation was typical of how American forces employed the L4. Simple aircraft, creative solutions, whatever worked. But perhaps the most remarkable L4 combat action didn't involve artillery observation or even Carpenter's bazooka attacks. It happened April 11, 1945, less than 1 month before Germany surrendered. Near Dannenberg, Germany, about 100 miles west of Berlin, First Lieutenant Duane Francis was flying an L4H on artillery observation duty. His aircraft was serial number 43-29905, nicknamed Miss Me? Francis was the pilot. Lieutenant William S. Martin was his observer riding in the back seat. They were flying at low altitude, maybe 500 feet, scanning for German positions to report back to artillery. Francis spotted an aircraft, German Fieseler Vieh 156 Storch, the German equivalent of the L4. An observation aircraft, high-wing monoplane, slow, maneuverable. Used for artillery spotting, liaison, casualty evacuation, the same roles the L-4 performed for American forces. The Storch was flying lower than Francis, maybe 300 feet altitude, flying slowly. The German crew apparently hadn't seen the American L-4 above and behind them. Francis had no offensive weapons mounted on his aircraft, no bazookas like Carpenter used, no machine guns, nothing but an L-4 Grasshopper with 2 men and their personal sidearms. 45 caliber Colt M 1911 pistols, standard issue for officers, 7-round magazine, effective range maybe 75 feet against a human target, not designed for air combat. Francis decided to attack anyway. He dove on the Storch, came up behind and below the German aircraft, closed to maybe 50 yards, point-blank range for aircraft. Martin, in the rear seat, leaned out the window. The L-4 had doors that could be removed or opened in flight. Martin had a clear field of fire. He started shooting his 45 caliber pistol at the Storch. Francis flew the L-4 with his left hand, drew his own pistol with his right hand, fired at the German aircraft while flying formation maybe 30 to 40 yards behind it. Both Americans were firing pistols at the Storch from a moving aircraft at a moving target. The Storch pilot realized he was under attack, tried to evade. The German aircraft turned hard, but the L-4 stayed with him. Both aircraft were slow, top speed maybe 85 to 90 miles per hour. Both were highly maneuverable. Neither had a performance advantage. The fight came down to who could shoot more accurately with handguns from an aircraft cockpit. Martin kept firing, emptied his 7-round magazine, reloaded while hanging out the window of a maneuvering aircraft, kept shooting. Bullets were hitting the Storch, punching holes in the fabric covering, hitting the engine. The Storch's engine began trailing smoke. The German pilot was trying to land, get the aircraft on the ground before the Americans shot it to pieces. The Storch descended, still taking fire from Martin's pistol. The German aircraft approached a field, tried to land. The Storch's right wing hit the ground first, dug into soft earth. The aircraft cartwheeled, wing broke off, fuselage tumbled. The Storch came to rest as a crumpled wreck. Francis landed his L-4 in the same field. He and Martin approached the destroyed Storch with pistols drawn. 2 German crewmen crawled out of the wreckage, shaken but unhurt, hands raised, surrendering. Francis and Martin captured them, turned them over to a passing American tank column. The Storch was completely destroyed, counted as an air-to-air kill, shot down by pistol fire from an L-4 Grasshopper. It was one of the last air-to-air victories in the European theatre. The war ended less than 1 month later, and it remains the only confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed by pistol fire during World War II. Francis received the Distinguished Flying Cross for the action. The award came 22 years later in 1967. Military bureaucracy moved slowly in processing such unusual actions, but it eventually recognized what Francis and Martin had accomplished. 2 men in an unarmed observation plane, attacking and destroying an enemy aircraft using nothing but personal sidearms. That action captured what the L-4 program represented: simple aircraft flown by determined crews willing to do whatever the mission required using whatever tools were available. The entire L-4 program embodied that philosophy. Take a simple, inexpensive civilian aircraft, train artillery officers to fly it, send them forward to observe and direct fire, let them figure out solutions to problems as those problems emerged. The results exceeded anything the program planners had envisioned. Major Charles Carpenter survived the war. He flew over 150 combat missions, received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions at Aracourt and subsequent combat operations, returned to the United States in early 1945 after being diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, a form of lymphatic cancer. Doctors at the time gave him perhaps 2 years to live. The prognosis for Hodgkin's disease in 1945 was grim: limited treatment options, poor survival rates. Carpenter was 32 years old, had survived combat against German tanks and flak and small arms fire over France, was expected to die from disease within 2 years. He returned to Illinois, went back to teaching high school history at Moline High School, resumed coaching football, the job he had left when he enlisted after Pearl Harbor. Carpenter also ran a boys' camp in the Ozarks during summer months, a camp focused on teaching outdoor skills and building character. teaching young men the kinds of lessons he had learned during the war: self-reliance, courage, determination. Carpenter rarely spoke about his combat experiences. When people asked about the war, he would mention he had flown observation planes. Not much more. The bazookas. The tank kills. The distinguished flying cross. Rosie the Rocketer. He kept those stories largely private, focused on teaching and working with young people. The Hodgkin's disease that doctors predicted would kill him within 2 years didn't. Carpenter lived 21 more years. He died March 22, 1966. He was 53 years old. Born August 29, 1912. The cancer that should have killed him in 1947 took 2 decades longer. He was buried in Illinois. His obituary mentioned his military service. Mentioned he had been a teacher and coach and camp director. Did not mention Rosie the Rocketer. Did not mention that he had been among the most effective tank destroyers in the European theatre, flying an unarmed observation plane with 6 bazookas mounted on the wings. His aircraft, serial number 43-300426, was either scrapped or sold as surplus after the war ended. Most L-4s met the same fate. The aircraft weren't valuable enough to justify shipping them back to the United States. Many were sold to civilians in Europe, where the J-3 Cub design remained popular for private aviation. Others were scrapped for aluminum and parts. A few were retained and eventually ended up in museums, but the vast majority of the 5,413 L-4 aircraft built during the war simply disappeared into post-war surplus. The program itself had permanent impact on military aviation doctrine and force structure. When the Army began adopting helicopters after World War II, the institutional memory and operational doctrine of the L-4 program proved essential. The concept of organic aviation for ground forces was already established. The bureaucratic battles with the Air Force had already been fought and won. The precedent existed that ground commanders needed their own aircraft for observation, liaison, and direct support. The helicopter programs of the 1950s and 60s built directly on the foundation the L-4 program had established. The arguments had already been made and won. Ground commanders needed organic aviation. Aerial observation was indispensable for artillery and ground operations. The success of the L-4 program helped establish Army aviation as a separate branch when the Air Force split off from the Army in 1947. The L-4 had proven that ground forces needed their own aircraft independent of Air Force control. The Korean War saw L-4s fly combat missions again. The aircraft performed artillery observation, casualty evacuation, and liaison missions exactly as they had in World War II. The L-4 was obsolete by Korean War standards. Better observation aircraft were available. The Cessna L-19 Bird Dog offered superior performance, but L-4s kept flying because they were simple, reliable, effective, and available. The Republic of Korea Air Force operated L-4s throughout the war. Started with 8 aircraft, acquired 20 more during the conflict. American artillery units used L-4s until being gradually replaced by L-19 aircraft in the early 1950s. By the time the Korean War ended in 1953, the L-4 was finally being retired from U.S. military service after more than a decade of combat operations across 2 wars and multiple theaters. The L-4 Grasshopper never received official recognition proportional to its impact during or immediately after World War II. Army Air Force's documentation emphasized heavy bombers and fighter aircraft, the strategic bombing campaign, air superiority battles, long-range escort missions. Artillery after-action reports focused on fire direction procedures and ammunition expenditure statistics. The L-4 was mentioned in passing, if mentioned at all. Histories of World War II aviation concentrated on dramatic aircraft: the B-17 Flying Fortress, the P-51 Mustang, the B-29 Super Fortress, not slow fabric-covered Cubs. But post-war military analysis eventually acknowledged what the L-4 had accomplished. Historians studying American artillery performance in World War II consistently identified aerial observation as the decisive factor in American artillery superiority. The L-4 enabled American artillery to respond faster, shoot more accurately, and coordinate more effectively than any other military's artillery system during the war. The 3-minute response time versus 10 to 15 minutes for German artillery. the ability to see and target German positions in real time, the capacity to adjust fire immediately based on observed results. All of that came from the L-4 and the pilots who flew them. Today, over 5,000 J-3 Cubs and L-4 Grasshoppers remain on the Federal Aviation Administration registry, still flying, still airworthy. They appear at air shows and vintage aircraft gatherings, fly in commemorative events, participate in the annual Sentimental Journey fly-in at Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, where Piper built the aircraft. When people see them today, they typically see charming antiques, yellow fabric, graceful high-wing design, nostalgia for simpler times in aviation. But to the soldiers who fought in World War II, especially German soldiers, the L-4 meant something completely different. It meant American artillery fire was coming. It meant observers overhead who could see everything. It meant movement during daylight brought immediate, deadly, accurate fire. It meant hide or die. Field Marshal Rommel understood that reality when he wrote his February 18, 1943 letter. An observation plane directed the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets throughout the zone. That observation plane was the L-4 Grasshopper, the simple $2,600 civilian aircraft that one of Germany's greatest commanders identified as a significant threat, the aircraft that fundamentally changed how ground wars are fought, not through advanced technology or overwhelming firepower, through solving the fundamental problem. Artillery needed to see targets. The L-4 provided eyes. Everything else followed from that simple solution. An artillery system that could see and respond in 3 minutes dominated battlefields against opponents who needed 10 to 15 minutes to accomplish the same mission. That 7 to 12-minute differential, multiplied across thousands of fire missions over years of combat, helped win the war. The L-4 Grasshopper, the simple fabric-covered aircraft that gave American artillery the eyes it needed to become the most effective artillery force in military history. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with more forgotten stories from World War II. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.